Good morning, middle school. It's Bible class number 6 of our online spring classwork right now. And even though it's not what we would want, we're making it good. And as I've told you every day, I miss having you guys around. Well, as you can see, I'm not in the classroom. I'm in my garage because I want to do a little experiment to kind of bring to life what's going on in our study today. I mentioned to you that the Bible begins with 5 books known as the Torah to the Jews, which Torah stands for law or instruction. And those 5 books are Genesis, which we studied this year, Exodus, the book we're starting now, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books form the books of the law for the Jews. Well, we introduced Exodus yesterday by saying there's 2 really important things to keep in mind. One is the time frame. For the story of Exodus begins 400 years after the life of Joseph. Now, Genesis tells us the story of a family through whom God was going to bring the Son of God into the world to rescue the world. That family started with Abraham. We studied him and his wife Sarah. Then we studied Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And then their 2 children, Jacob and Esau. And we studied mostly the life of Jacob and his sons and his daughter Dinah. Well, one of his sons, Joseph, the favorite of Jacob, the son of the wife that he loved, Rachel, was sold into slavery by his brothers out of their hatred for him because they sensed his father's favoritism of Joseph. So he ends up as a slave in Egypt, and through a series of circumstances that God was working behind the scenes, Joseph ends up being the second most powerful person in Egypt. The whole family of Jacob moves to Egypt where they're cared for, and then the Bible in Genesis closes with the death of Jacob and then the death of Joseph. Now, the 400 years then, of that time frame that the book of Exodus kind of tells us you got to know this, is it means that after 400 years, nobody remembers Joseph and how he helped rescue Egypt from a terrible famine. In fact, it says right in the text that the new Pharaoh, the new king in Egypt, didn't know Joseph, didn't know anything about his family, didn't care to know. And it plunged Israel into the family of Israel into the second important thing to know in Exodus, which was they became enslaved people. Because the 400 years time period meant that nobody remembered Joseph and what he did for Egypt. As a result, the Egyptians saw the growing number of people who related to Joseph through his family as cheap slave labor. And so that's what happens. They enslave the family of Joseph, which had grown into thousands and thousands of people. So I'm going to read from Exodus, then we're going to do a little experiment here. This is Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and war breaks out. They will join our enemies and fight against us and leave our country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh kinds of labor and brick and mortar and all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So the Egyptians are fearful of the population, the growing population of Israelites, the family of Jacob. So they decide to force them into slavery, and they use them as forced labor for all the government projects. Well, part of that forced labor was they had to make the bricks in which they were going to use to build the government projects. Now, those bricks were made out of mud and water, the sun, and a binding agent, often that was straw. So we're going to make one of those bricks here, and we're going to see in a few days what it's like. I found an article about archaeologists who actually went to Egypt and made bricks, sun-dried bricks, as the Egyptians would have done it thousands of years ago. So we're going to make one now. So you need a form. All I have is this little piece of Tupperware. they would have had some sort of wood form for their bricks. You need water, you need mud or dirt, and you need a binding agent. And that binding agent then is straw. What the straw does is it holds the brick together once it's dried by the sun. Now we do that today. If you pour a concrete driveway, they put binding agent, which is mesh rebar, into the concrete that's like a heavy fence. Think of a heavy fence. It's laid right into the gravel before the pouring takes place. Then they pour the concrete. That rebar holds the concrete together. That's what the straw does for the mud bricks. So we're gonna get our hands dirty here. We're gonna see if we can make some mud and make a mud brick. And we're gonna see what it looks like. I've got here a trowel I use when I'm drywalling, and I'm doing mud work for drywall. And what they do is when they get the water in here, they knead it and knead the mud over and over. Now, if we were doing this in Egypt, this would cover a long process. Once you get the mud made and formed, and you would knead it and knead it, they said the archaeologists said that they would knead this in large pits with their feet for hours and hours. Then they'd let it cure for about a week. Then they come back and knead it again, and that's when they would add the straw. Then they would put the mud into the form and then let it sun dry for a week or more, and then they would take it out of the mold, or they would, after it was sun dried, it was ready to be used. All right, now, I can't stay down here and knead this for hours like they would. We're going to see a movie later in the year on the Ten Commandments, and when we do, you'll see a really good reenactment of how they would have done this. All right, so we got this mud kneaded, so now you've got to knead into it this straw, and the straw becomes the binding agent for the bricks. Okay? Now I probably should have cut this up some more than I did, but you knead it in there, and this straw binds, and the reason they would knead it over and over is it would evenly distribute the straw as the binding agent in the mud. And we are going to make a mud brick similar to what they did in Egypt. And this is what the Israelites were forced to do. They weren't allowed to have their own jobs. They were forced to do this as slaves to Egypt. And they did this every single day. You can imagine that. You wake up in the morning, what are you going to do? You're going to make bricks. And because Egypt doesn't get much rainfall, it's not like you had time off because of bad weather. So once they get it kneaded, then they put it into a form. So that's what our Tupperware is going to be. So I'm going to put this in the Tupperware, and I'm going to shape it to form the Tupperware here. And then what I'll do, cut that down. Now, hopefully, when this cures a little bit, and I can pop it out of the mold, then we will set it out into the sun and let it dry. Now I'm going to pat this down with this drywall knife to get it smooth. They would have used some sort of a piece of wood or something to smooth these out on the top. And we will see, ladies and gentlemen, what our Egyptian mud brick might be like after cures. And the point of this is the Israelites did this day in and day out, every single day, all year long. The weather was always warm, they didn't get very much rain, and this is what their lives, every day, for 400 years. And they cried out for God for deliverance, but God had a reason for making it last 400 years. And there's a lesson in there. There's a lesson for that, for at least for me anyway. And it says that when we're in difficult times, we cry out for deliverance, and it seems like God isn't doing anything. it may be because God has a plan in mind that we simply don't know the details about it. So, no assignment. I wanted you to think about this is what the Israelites were doing when they were enslaved in the book of Exodus, chapter 1. And we'll see what happens to them later in a couple of chapters because things get worse for them as God was going to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians. So this is Tuesday, March 31st, and I'm out.